Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into the origins and evolving evolution of the American government. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill Obrien. He's also the host of this discussion. And here he is now, Dr. Bill Obrien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to this Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Wednesday. It is the 25th day of September in the year 2019. It is a pleasure to be with you once again today. I hope everybody is doing well. I trust that you are. Agnes and I were chatting before we came on the air about all this hullabaloo about the whistleblower report and the Ukraine phone call and all the rest of it. And it's becoming unbelievably complex and confusing. And, you know, it's just one more thing. And I think, as we mentioned yesterday, we were kind of anticipating the meeting yesterday afternoon among Democrats. And indeed, it did come out very quickly that impeachment seems to be the order of the day. Nancy Pelosi came out for it, and since then, a number of other Democrats have come out as well. So, but we still don't have. It's going to take 218 votes in the House to impeach, and so the last I heard, which is about an hour and a half ago, there were 211 people who have come out in favor of it, of going for impeachment. There are still a number of Democrats left, and obviously it's going to be a very partisan operation. And I was reading this morning that comments by Newt Gingrich, because he was the speaker, the head in the House, the Republican majority, when they moved to impeach Bill Clinton. And he pointed out, correctly, that the fallout from that really hurt the Republicans. They lost a number of seats in the next election, et cetera. So Gingrich's argument is that the Democrats might be sorry that they go in this direction. But it's very clear, given what the situation is, that the president continues to push the issue, which kind of brings me back to the comments on yesterday's program about whether, in fact, impeachment might be something that President Trump wants for a number of reasons. He seems to be acting this way, and this morning, in response to the action of the Democrats yesterday, he kind of came out licking his chops and saying this is exactly what he wants. And so who knows? It's extremely, extremely confusing. But at the same time, we're talking here about abuse of power. We're not talking obstruction of justice as yet. We're talking about abuse of power. And I think one of the things that we're going to have to keep our eyes on as this procedure or process moves forward is how expansive the call for impeachment is. In other words, whether it's going to focus on just this one issue or whether it's going to focus on a number of things in the Mueller report. Because if you recall, in previous months, the Trump administration has really, when you look at it, has been very successful in tamping down the outrage over some of the things that he has done. There's no question, for example, and I think everybody pretty much agrees on this, that the Attorney General, William Barr, effectively took the steam out of the Mueller report. Everybody was anxiously awaiting release of the Mueller report. But the fact of the matter is, once the announcement was once the decision was made to release it, there was a period of time during which the Attorney General was able to prepare the public for what it said. But in reality, by the time it came out, the Attorney General had effectively set the tone and set the context. And consequently, the Mueller report was kind of hit with a thud. And, you know, a few weeks before that, everybody was anxiously trying to get their hands on it and awaiting it. And then the Attorney General, of course, if you remember, announced that there was not enough evidence to justify a move to an impeachment move based on obstruction of justice. There wasn't enough there to prove a crime and of obstruction of justice. And the fact of the matter is, then, when the Mueller report did become available, not that many people were as eager to read it as they were. So, in a sense, what the administration and the president's supporters have been able to do thus far is really cushion some of the worst outrages that this administration has been involved in. And so now there's this one. And one has to wonder what the strategy will be. Because so far it's been apparently seemingly successful. And yet the president continues to create a new issue before the old one is even settled. So it's going to be interesting. I've got an article out of this morning's Times here on this particular issue that I wanted to share with you, and I think it's very, very revealing. But first, I'd like to give you an invitation to join us, if you will, by taking advantage of the 800 number we have, 844 the Horn, calling into the studios and coming on the air with us and sharing your thoughts, whether it's on impeachment or whether it's on the Ukraine situation, whatever it might be. I want you to know that if you've got something you would like to say, we would love to hear it. Not just me, but our other listeners as well. So again, the number is 844 the Horn, or another way you can get into the studios is through Skype. And you can make direct contact with the studio that way. Agnes will get you on the air and you'll be on with us. If you'd like to make a comment directly to me related to the program, then you can do that in one of two ways. You can either send me an email or you can communicate through our Facebook page. If you'd like to send me an email, my email address is waobrien906 @gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN, 906, all one word, lowercase, no punctuation, @gmail.com. Or if you go to our Facebook page, just type in the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution in the search box at the top of the homepage of Facebook, and you'll be onto our Facebook page, and you'll see a number of postings there. And at the end of each posting, there is a computer link, a share link, and a comment link. If you click on the share link, it sends that particular posting to all the friends on your Facebook account. So if you think a particular posting there is something that those who are friends with you on Facebook ought to and would like to read, then by all means, we would appreciate that, because obviously it gives us more exposure. If you click on the comment button, it gives you the opportunity to make a comment directly to me. And when you post that comment, my Facebook account immediately notifies me that there has been a comment made to one of the postings on our Facebook page. And then Facebook takes me to the posting and to your comment. In theory, of course, that suggests that your comment would be related to the posting, but it doesn't have to be. You can make the comment on whatever you want and just use the Facebook page or that particular posting as an opportunity to make your comment. Whatever way you choose to communicate with us, please know that we appreciate it. We appreciate you out there and the fact that you continue to support us, and we would love to hear from you. So thank you very, very much. There are a couple of things. I wanted to touch on this situation on the kerfuffle over the phone call of July 25th between President Trump and the President Zelensky of the Ukraine, which we kind of talked about yesterday. And I really don't have that much more to say, because I think we kind of set the stage for what happened, which was the decision by the Speaker to move towards an impeachment inquiry. And now the media is all over this in terms of what happens now and what to expect and all these other things. And I saw on a discussion this morning on one of the media stations. The question was, how does it work? How does the Constitution say impeachment works? What happens? And of course, the major mistaken idea among many people is that impeachment constitutes removal from office. It doesn't until 2/3 of the Senate support it. Impeachment requires a majority vote of the House. And so, in theory, because they have a majority of 40 seats, in theory, the Democrats would have enough clout in the House to vote items of impeachment. But then it would go to the Senate. And 2/3 of the Senate would have to support it before removal from office became a reality. 2/3 votes in the Senate would mean that 20 Republicans would have to support it as well as Democrats. And that's considered to be highly unlikely. And that's considered to be the reason why President Trump seems to relish it, because he knows at the bottom, at the end of the day, it won't go anywhere. However, it will become a burden that he'll have to carry going into the 2020 elections. And then it comes down to whether, in fact, those who supported him before will continue to support him. And so far, there's an awful lot of indication that his popularity with his base has not shrunk materially. So that's the basis of this piece by John Yoo. John Yoo, I apologize for the phone. I'm going to take it off the hook. As I mentioned, John Yoo is a law professor at Berkeley, the University of California at Berkeley. And I'm trying to get my ducks in a row here. More specifically, I'm trying to get my hands on the John Yoo piece. Here it is. I've mislaid it. his article is entitled "Beware of Impeaching Trump. It Could Hurt the Presidency." Basically, what he's talking about is that impeachment would infringe on the president's unilateral power to control and conduct foreign policy. And therefore, it could hurt the power of the presidency in the long run. And this is an argument that many people have made, that the administration makes, the argument that President Trump can do pretty much anything he wants in office, and that no matter what he does, nothing can happen to him until he leaves office. And this is interesting, because this denies the idea of separation of powers and congressional oversight over the executive branch. I wanted to point out just a couple of sections of John Yoo's article in order to look at the way he makes his points, because I think you'll get the idea just in the way it's written. In the first paragraph, for example, Yoo says House Speaker Nancy Pelosi authorized the opening of an impeachment inquiry over accusations that President Trump abused his foreign relations powers to target political rivals. And then the next sentence is the one I want to focus on. Realizing the gravity of the affair, the president had announced that the White House would release an unclassified and unredacted transcript of a phone call at the center of the whistleblower complaint. And the way that is worded, by saying the president had announced that the White House would release the transcript of the phone call, the implication is that the president complied immediately with releasing this transcript. And the fact of the matter is that raises questions, because the reality is the president's decision to release the transcript was in response to the actions of the House, rather than in front of it. If the president had immediately agreed to release the transcript of the phone call, then the concerns which prompted the House to meet on impeachment, it seems to me, wouldn't have been as important as it was. Adam Schiff said, if the president is essentially withholding military aid, at the same time he's trying to browbeat a foreign leader into doing something illicit, providing dirt on his opponent during a presidential campaign, Schiff said, impeachment may be the only remedy that is co-equal to the evil. In other words, the evil, or the crime, if you will, is so serious that the response to it must be equally as serious. John Yoo's response is, we should beware, but before we rush into impeachment, because, quote, it may do long-term harm to the presidency and our national security. And the next paragraph is one I particularly found quite interesting. The Constitution vests the president with the authority to conduct foreign policy and the responsibility to protect the nation's security. A president, even one who is possibly engaging in wrongdoing, must have confidence in the confidentiality of his communications, or he will be unable to perform his constitutional duties, and our international relations will fall victim to government by committee, unquote. I think the phrase the president must have confidence in the confidentiality of his communications, even a president who is possibly engaging in wrongdoing. I think all of us should take pause over that sentence. Because basically, to agree with that is to say that nothing the president does, criminal or not, should interfere with his right to do his job and have his communications remain private. In other words, it effectively denies the whole idea of oversight. That's the kind of power that the administration is claiming. John Yoo is defending it. And I think in order to do that, he's got to make some compromises with history. Let me give you one example. He's quoting Alexander Hamilton on the idea of the president being a one-man executive rather than the idea many people had of a three-person or a two-person executive. Yu says the framers sought to reverse the failures brought by the legislative control over foreign policy. Let me repeat that. The framers sought to reverse the failures brought by legislative control over foreign policy. The fact of the matter is that's not exactly what the framers were doing. And Hamilton indeed believed that you had to put power in the hands of one person. But part of the reason that he believed that is because if one person held the executive, if only one person was president, that made oversight easier. That made accountability and responsibility for one's behavior in office easier and more efficient. If you had multiple people making executive decisions, it would be a lot more difficult to hold anybody accountable for anything because they could pass the ball back and forth. So yes, Hamilton believed in a one-person executive, but he didn't believe that that executive ought to have total freedom, total carte blanche to do anything and everything he wanted, even wrongdoing. Because what that would do would contradict the impeachment clause in the first place. In other words, if the only response to a president who is committing wrongdoing is the next election, then the impeachment clause effectively becomes negative. It's gone. It's ineffective. It means nothing. So the fact that they put the impeachment clause in there so that a president could be removed from office suggests clearly that there are oversight responsibilities in a checks and balances system. John Yoo is making a very subtle, shrewd argument to try to deny checks and balances, I believe. He quotes Hamilton from Federalist number 74. Of all the cares or concerns of government, the direction of war must peculiarly demand those qualities which distinguish the exercise of power by a single hand, Hamilton wrote in Federalist number 74. 74. I went back this morning and looked again at Federalist 74. And indeed, this quote is in there. But there's quite a bit of difference between leading a nation in the time of war and making promises to foreign powers about interfering in our elections and not allowing anybody to know about it. In other words, when Hamilton is writing about the advantages of a single executive, he's talking about efficiency. In Federalist 70, Hamilton wrote, "Decision, activity, secrecy, and dispatch will generally characterize the proceedings of one man." In other words, a one-man executive is more decisive, able to move quicker, can function in secret, in private, and with efficiency, with dispatch. But again, there's a difference between war and a phone call which proposes or seeks to elicit behavior that is criminal. Hamilton is talking about efficiency in the executive. He's not talking about wartime. And he's not talking about a president committing a potential crime. Hamilton is not writing about criminals being the executive. He's writing about executives being able to lead the nation effectively and efficiently. John Yoo is kind of twisting Hamilton around a little bit and changing the context in order to take Hamilton's words and get them to mean something different than Hamilton said. It's very, very subtle. Then Yoo goes on to say, and I've heard this argument, of course, an intelligence officer cannot file a whistleblower complaint against the president because the president is not a member of the intelligence community, nor does a presidential phone call with a foreign leader qualify as an intelligence operation. The intelligence community works for the president, not the other way around. That is, it seems to me, is a blanket statement of top-down power. The implication there is that there's no accountability in the behavior of the person at the top. And I think, and the article goes on. I'm not going to go into all of it, but it's a well-written but very subtle effort to justify unchecked executive power. Let me give you another example from that article. If Congress could regulate, this is John Yoo speaking, if Congress could regulate presidential discussions with foreign leaders, presidents and foreign leaders would speak less candidly or stop making the calls altogether, and United States foreign policy would be crippled. Congress would seize the upper hand in foreign affairs, which has produced disasters in our history, such as the War of 1812, restrictions on providing aid to the Allies before American entry into World War II. Then he makes the following statement. In the 1970s, congressional interference after Watergate handicapped the efforts of Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter to respond to the Soviet military buildup, communist expansion in Latin America and Africa, the fall of Vietnam and Iran's revolution. Only with Ronald Reagan's restoration of executive power could the United States carry out the strategy that ultimately won the Cold War. Again, a justification for unchecked executive power. There is a difference between oversight of the behavior and activities of the executive and control. of what the executive is empowered to do. In other words, they are not interchangeable. John Yoo is implying that they are. John Yoo is suggesting that if anybody does anything to oversee or interfere with the president's right to conduct foreign policy, it constitutes a shift of executive power from the president to the legislature, to Congress. I would suggest there's a long way between those two extremes. Because if you agree with him, if you agree with that, then you are agreeing with his argument that only unchecked presidential power in the areas of conducting foreign policy is allowed. And consistent with that is John Yoo's conclusion of his article. And that is, Democratic presidential candidates, he said, are calling for impeachment. But they should realize that they themselves remain the framers' primary remedy for presidential abuses of power. The Constitution trusts the American people, acting through the ballot box, to render judgment on President Trump. Democrats should trust the framers' faith in the American people too. Yoo's conclusion then is that the voters in 2020 will have an opportunity not to re-elect this president. That's the check on executive behavior, not legislative oversight, is what John Yoo is arguing. He quotes Governor Randolph in the 1788 Virginia Ratifying Convention in June of 1788. If he misbehaves, he may be impeached. And in this case, he will never be reelected. The implication, clearly, then, is that if you are impeached, even if you are not found guilty and thrown out of office by 2/3 of the Senate, you won't be elected. John Yoo is asking us to rely on that. That's how far this whole issue has gone, and how dangerous constitutionally that it is. It's something that it seems to me all of us need to keep an eye on and to watch closely. Because if we don't, then we're going to be told what people want us to believe. And I think that's always a danger, but in this particular case, I think we're witnessing that. In yesterday's program, if you remember, if you were with us yesterday, I was talking principally, and the whole second hour was devoted to the presentation I made a week ago on the background to the Constitution, the overview of the Confederation period that led to the Constitutional Convention. And one of the things that I concluded at the very end of the program was that if you had to pinpoint one major factor, one major cause that of the convening of the Constitutional Convention, it was fear and distress to the people. The fact that Republican government requires civic virtue on the part of its citizens, and that the history of the 1780s demonstrated that citizens were not up to that challenge. That in effect the founders had more faith in the American people than they had a right to have. The people had failed them, therefore the people were responsible for the need to revise the Articles of Confederation. And that leads directly into the conclusion that the Constitution was a counter-revolution to the Declaration of Independence. In other words, that the Constitution of the United States was an effort to take back power that the Declaration of Independence seemingly gave the people and restore it to the people best able to handle it. Elites and aristocrats. And the statement that I made yesterday, which I think is quite valid and verifiable, that if you look at the nation in 1776, the majority of the people who mattered in the various states, colonies, until the Declaration and then states, did not want independence because they were afraid of it. And what they were afraid of is what Gordon Wood called a social revolution. That the order of society would be disrupted. That once you undertook to sever the connection with the mother country, to, in a sense, revolt from independence from the country, you were basically upsetting the entire structure and order of society. And once you started that rock rolling down the hill, there was no way to stop it. And that's been the impression, the interpretation of the background to the Constitution ever since. And what I didn't have time to do yesterday, and what I wanted to take a few minutes today to do in order to kind of complete that story, is to give you some of the evidence that exists for that particular thesis or for that particular narrative. In 1775, October of 1775, in Massachusetts, in Boston, Josiah Quincy, who was an attorney in Boston, in a letter to John Adams, who he worked on cases with, and let me tell you that Josiah Quincy and John Adams were the two defense attorneys that got the British troops off in the Boston Massacre. And you remember, I'm sure you will remember, that John Adams became very unpopular for defending the British troops. So heated was the political situation in Massachusetts, in Boston at that time. Adams argued that as an attorney, it was his professional responsibility to provide defense for all those accused of a crime, and that included the British soldiers. And he was joined in that defense by Josiah Quincy. Anyway, Quincy wrote to John Adams in October of 1775, "Your zeal to get rid of the reins of government will see the man of substance reduced to a level with those who have none. After you have secured your darling liberty, what is to become of your property?" Unquote. Let me emphasize in that particular letter, that particular statement, the phrase that when you get rid of the reins of government, you will see the man of substance reduced to a level of the people who don't have any substance. In other words, it'll be chaos. And that's why so many were opposed to independence. John Jay in 1775, and I know I made this statement before, "The people who own this country ought to run it," unquote. In Pennsylvania, in the Pennsylvania Gazette, 1775, "Men who 10 years ago were not worthy to shine my shoes now ride in carriages through Philadelphia in lace cuffs and other finery." And the implication there, who the hell do they think they are? What's happening to this society is implied there. John Dickinson, who chairs the committee to draft the Articles of Confederation, John Dickinson said, "A union without bonds of union is like a cask without hoops. Only a powerful central government can secure the revolution and maintain liberty." Unquote. Noah Webster, "In a government formed by the people, tyranny can never be established. But in a nation without centralized authority, tyranny will inevitably create itself." Unquote. In other words, you got to have somebody at the top, somebody in power. Gouverneur Morris, who's a noted nationalist. "The Confederation's defects inevitably lead to a sense of want and lead men among the more elevated ranks who love peace, quiet establishments, and permanent security to see the error of trusting power to improper hands." Translation: we had too much faith in the people's ability to govern themselves. At the Constitutional Convention in 1787, on the 18th of June, and we've had programs devoted to this, Alexander Hamilton delivered a 6-hour speech to the convention on the Constitution as it was taking shape. Madison, in his notes, makes mention of the fact that up to that time, Hamilton had said not one word in the convention. The convention opened in late May. This was the 18th of June. So he sat there for a couple of weeks and said nothing. And then when he did speak, he spoke for 6 hours. And in that 6-hour speech, he makes the following comments. And this I've read before. "All communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The first are the rich and well-born. The others, the mass of the people. The voice of the people has been said to be the voice of God. And however generally this maxim has been quoted and believed, it is not true in fact. The people are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge or determine right. Give therefore to the first class a distinct, permanent share in the government. They will check the unsteadiness of the second, and as they cannot receive any advantage by change, they therefore will ever maintain good government," unquote. So the translation for all of this is that ultimately it's where the power lies, which people have it, that makes the difference. And many people believe and interpret the Constitution to be an effort to take a couple of steps back from the faith in the people that motivated independence. And that, in a sense, what you had to do, they believed, is create the kind of government which would fall into the hands of the right people. James Madison, Federalist number 10. This one I read yesterday. "The effect of the first difference between a democracy and a republic is, on the one hand, to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it, love of country, to temporary or partial considerations. Under such a regulation, it may well happen that the public voice pronounced by the representatives of the people will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves, convened for the purpose, unquote. I call your attention to Madison's use in that paragraph of the phrase, a chosen body of citizens. Because there is a tendency, an inclination to interpret the word chosen as being the elite, the qualified, the upper class, or as Donald Trump said recently, I am the chosen one. Madison, when he talks about chosen, is talking about being elected, winning an election. So in other words, you come from the community at large, and you are selected by the people to represent them. But then Madison says that these people will have the wisdom to best discern the true interests of their country and the patriotism and love of justice that will make them less likely to sacrifice the welfare of their country to temporary or partial considerations. The question that I've always had about that has been, where are these people of wisdom and patriotism and love of justice coming from? Because earlier in Federalist number 10, Madison made the point that self-interest, factions, the inclination to join other people who want the same things you do, knowing that if you organize, you got a better chance of getting what you want. And Madison said at the beginning of Federalist number 10 that factions are sown in the nature of man. In other words, self-interest is in man's nature. You can't do anything about it. This is what people are. This is what human nature is. Self-interest. Now he's talking about people, the citizens voting for people with wisdom and patriotism and love of justice, which contradicts the idea of self-interest in human nature. So how do you resolve that contradiction, is my question. And that's been the issue, it seems to me, that lies at the heart of this whole thing. Because Madison is telling us in Federalist number 10 and Federalist number 51 especially, that the process of elections in a republic is a process of what he calls civic education. It allows the leaders, those that are elected as representatives, who maintain frequent contact with their constituents, to basically bring to the citizens who elected them the insights and information they need to be well informed and make good decisions. Citizens then learn how to be good citizens from the people they elect. The representatives, in Madison's eyes, become mentors of the citizenry. And in their behavior, they are demonstrating to citizens the kinds of qualities that good representatives must have. Good representatives must be those who understand and recognize that the national interest must come ahead of self-interest in order for a republic to be successful. And they behave accordingly. So in a sense, what Madison is doing here, seems to me, is sketching out a system of civic education that to a large extent seems to have been missed by many people who study this period. And that leads me to the introduction of a constitutional scholar named Larry Kramer. I know it's been several months, maybe more than a couple of years. I've mentioned Larry Kramer before. Let me tell you who Larry Kramer is. My first exposure to him was one day driving the car, and I had Sirius radio on, and I was listening to the Larry Smerconish program, which is on every day on Sirius from 9 to noon. And in one of the hours, he had Larry Kramer as his guest. And I was drawn to the program, and I listened to this whole segment with Larry Kramer because Larry Kramer's theme or subject was James Madison. And what I was hearing about Larry Kramer was that he was a law professor and that he was dean of the law school at Stanford in California. And that he had resigned his position as dean of the law school to assume the role as executive director of the Hewlett Foundation, which is a charitable institution that distributes tens of millions of dollars to community needs and projects around the country. And that what Smerconish was featuring on this particular interview was the latest initiative of the Hewlett Foundation, and that initiative was Larry Kramer's initiative. And that was to devote resources from the Hewlett Foundation to what Kramer called the James Madison Initiative, which was to promote Madison's dream of a deliberative republic in which citizens would participate actively in government itself. In other words, what Larry Kramer was talking about was a James Madison that we didn't know. Because here was a James Madison that we believed one thing about in terms of the Constitution of the United States. But Larry Kramer was introducing us to another James Madison. Based on this particular discussion, I became very interested in tracking down and finding out more about Larry Kramer and Larry Kramer's scholarship, especially when it came to James Madison. And what I've learned, it seems to me, is very, very significant. Very significant. So what I'd like to do for today, for the rest of our time together today, and probably for the next couple of programs as well, is to familiarize all of us with this thesis on James Madison. Let me first of all say that there is an essay written by Larry Kramer. And the title of the essay is The Interest of the Man, James Madison, Popular Constitutionalism, and the Theory of Deliberative Democracy. That's a mouthful, I know. The Interest of the Man, James Madison, Popular Constitutionalism, and the Theory of Deliberative Democracy. In that piece, Larry Kramer points out that he has two goals. In 2004, he published a book entitled The People Themselves, which lays out his views on James Madison, not just on the Constitution, but on James Madison himself. And he touches on many of the things that we've talked about over the years here on the Virtual Center. And I believe that it would do all of us well to go back over some of these things and to give them in some cases, a second look. Because I think that this Madison scholar really raises some important points. He says, from a historical perspective, my principal aim in writing this book in 2004 was to counter the idea that our Constitution was, first and foremost, an instrument of reaction against an instrument of reaction designed to blunt democratic politics by channeling authority to an elite removed as far as possible from popular control. Unquote. Let me read that again. In particular, the key myth about the founding that I wanted to counter was the idea that our Constitution, more than anything else, was an instrument of reaction designed to blunt democratic politics by channeling authority to an elite removed as far as possible from popular control. Translation: he really believes that the idea that the Constitution was an effort to step back and was an admission that the founders had too much faith in the people's ability to self-govern was misplaced. He challenges this. And his statement or his thesis is that that was not James Madison. That was not the Constitution that James Madison wrote. That what Madison's intent was in the Constitution was not to undo democracy, but to ensure that it worked and worked well. It was not a step back from democracy. It was two steps forward to give democracy what it needed in order to work. And that's what Larry Kramer in his book, The People Themselves, called, part of his title, Popular Constitutionalism. The second goal of Larry Kramer's scholarship is to challenge the idea of what he calls judicial supremacy when it comes to the Constitution of the United States. You'll remember, I'm sure, that in one of his earlier and more important opinions, John Marshall basically made the statement that it is the role of the court, the Supreme Court of the United States, to say what the law is. In other words, to tell us or to determine what the Constitution means. That's an issue that Larry Kramer wants to take on as well. Because if you think about that, literally, if the Supreme Court, in other words, if it's judges and courts that are the only way to interpret the meaning of the Constitution, then by definition, you are saying that the people do not have the power, the authority, or the wisdom to interpret it for themselves. You are, in effect, denying the citizens of a republic the right to interpret the law. Instead, you are giving that right of interpretation to attorneys and to courts and to judges. And that's one that Larry Kramer wants to channel as well. And I have to say, we've gone a couple of minutes beyond the top of the hour, so let me just make this statement, and then we'll pause and take our break. I've been one who's been very, very involved in seeing the Constitution of the United States as anti-democratic. And part of that comes from my own training. As I mentioned numerous times, in graduate school, my advisor was Merrill Jensen, and Merrill Jensen was part of the so-called progressive school of history. And basically, this is the movement, the progressive movement, that began early in the 20th century to challenge corporate power in America. And that created a whole movement among historians who were emphasizing the differences in the idea of class and the relationship between class and wealth on the one hand and political power on the other. And Jensen came out of that school, and so did I. And so my inclinations were to see Madison as a Virginia planter and to recognize that Madison's whole upbringing in Virginia was as a member of the aristocracy. And so my assumption naturally would be that when Madison wrote the Constitution, his intent was to deny the people power by giving it to the people best qualified to exercise it, which suggested the elite that Kramer talks about. Kramer, in effect, challenges this. And he's got me rethinking and rereading Madison as I haven't done in years. And I'm beginning to see in Madison things that I hadn't seen before. Over the recent months, I've started to see it. I've mentioned more than once about this idea of civic education because I see it in Madison. I see it in Federalist number 10. But at the same time, I saw Madison as trusting citizens to elect the right people, the chosen people, the best people, and then giving them the power. What Kramer is talking about is educating the people so that they can exercise the power that Madison and some of the other framers wanted them to exercise, which is the basis of a republic. So that's the theme. I'd like to begin after we take our break to kind of flesh that out a little bit more. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It's 6 minutes after the hour into our second hour. We're going to pause and take a break for about 4 minutes, and then we'll come back, and that should leave us about 50 minutes, a little bit better than 45 minutes, to get into this business with Larry Kramer and James Madison. We'll be right back. Thank you.
return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's your host, Dr. Bill Obrien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to this, our second hour in today's edition of the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Again, today is the 25th day of September. It is a Wednesday, and what that means is that we will not be back with you again until the first day, Monday next week. So today, this is our final hour of broadcasting for this program on the week. If you are just joining us, we welcome you to this hour. If you've been with us the first hour, then you are aware that I kind of set this up by introducing Larry Kramer, who is the author of a book called The People Themselves, and is an author of this essay, which appears in the Valparaiso Law Journal. It was written in 2007, and the title is The Interest of Man: James Madison, Popular Constitutionalism, and the Theory of Deliberative Democracy. And we have talked before, and I tried to set the stage for this at the end of our first hour. So very, very briefly, let me just share with you that Larry Kramer was dean of the law school at Stanford until he assumed executive leadership of the Hewlett Foundation, I believe in 2015. And he has instituted an initiative at the Hewlett Center, which he calls the James Madison Initiative. And what the program is dedicated to doing is reinvigorating and reestablishing the idea of deliberative democracy that James Madison felt was the best way for this republic to govern itself, for the citizens to govern, to participate actively and intelligently in their own government. It is an education process. What I didn't say in the first hour, and I think I probably should have, and I'll say it now, and of course I've said this many times previously, is that what we are experiencing in this country now, the fact that we are on the verge of yet another impeachment challenge, we are heading toward the completion of the third year of the Trump presidency. The Wall Street Journal has already documented in the neighborhood of 12,000 lies that this president has committed since he's been in office. And now we're dealing with a political crisis that shows every signs of moving toward impeachment. Yesterday, Speaker Nancy Pelosi basically gave in to those who within her party, within her caucus, who have been advocating impeachment of President Trump for some time. Yesterday, after a meeting, late yesterday afternoon, she came out of that meeting and announced that she had now, based on what surfaced over this Ukrainian situation, this conversation between our president and the president of the Ukraine, was an impeachable act that clearly was an abuse of power, and that therefore she was now planning to take the House into an impeachment inquiry. And many of us continue to wonder, and we've speculated in programs over the last couple of years, as to what constitutes the basis of the president's base. What is it that drives these Trump supporters? How could the people elect a man of this character to the highest office in the land? I guess what I'm saying is that if you think about it, those who argue that the framers of the Constitution felt that the Articles of Confederation needed revision, in fact, needed overall change, because the Confederation period had demonstrated that the people were not capable of governing themselves, that the civic virtue, the willingness of citizens to put the public interest ahead of their own self-interest, that is at the heart of republicanism, isn't there, or at least not sufficiently to warrant good government. And the thinking was that if something wasn't done, this newly independent nation would crumble. Independence would go for naught. I've mentioned before a book on the Confederation period called The Critical Period by John Fiske. And his thesis is that the Confederation was a test as to whether independence and the creation of a republic could really work. And the Constitution of the United States can be looked upon as a statement of realization on the part of the framers that the people were not up to the challenge. That those who trusted the people to participate wisely in a republic had placed too much faith in the people and in the virtue of the people. And therefore it was necessary to do something about it or to risk losing the whole game. It seems to me, when you think about it, that enough people supported this president to elect him, even though he didn't get a popular majority. He did get a majority in the Electoral College. And it's causing many people to believe that he could win again. So one has to wonder whether this idea that the Constitution was a step backwards from faith in the people was misplaced, or whether in fact they really knew what they were talking about, because we're seeing evidences that they were right, that trusting the people to put the national interest first, put the nation's interest first, may be naive, may be a mistake. And that leads to the interpretation of Madison that has become so popular. Larry Kramer is out to challenge that particular interpretation. And he's also out to challenge the idea that it's the courts that tells us what the Constitution means. Kramer says, in a nutshell, this is the principle of judicial supremacy. By trusting that the court will tell us what the law is, with the people not playing a role in that. According to this perspective, Kramer says, these folks believe that the community at large has no formal authority to interpret. On the contrary, resisting popular views about the meaning of the Constitution is considered a judicial virtue, which is why battles over the Supreme Court appointments have become so fierce in recent years. Since we have conceded the courts, Kramer says, the total power and authority to interpret the Constitution, that makes who sits on the court critically important. And consequently, the parties fight over it. confirmation hearings become brutal. I think all you have to do is look at the last two, Kavanaugh, and the one before it, Neil Gorsuch. And the fact that Mitch McConnell held that seat open for almost a year, rather than let President Obama make a Supreme Court appointment in his last year as president. Kramer says that popular constitutionalism is different. And he points out that in the founding period, in the period of the founding, constitutionalism was different. Power to interpret constitutional law was thought to reside with the people, not with judges, not with attorneys, not with any branch of government. It was the responsibility of the people to ensure the proper implementation of the day-to-day process of governing. And what, in essence, this is about is the difference between politics and law. When you talk about the Constitution as being the law of the land, then you are in essence saying, because it's law, only people trained in it can accurately interpret it. And so there is a tendency to separate politics and law. And Kramer points out that where there's a certain freedom in politics, in other words, you're free to choose or elect who you want, the law is thought to be different. Because the law has substance. It has an objective component that binds and limits what you can say. Many people today call it textualism. The words of the Constitution, the way it's written, basically mean that when you interpret the Constitution, it's got to be based on what's in it, on the text, and considering things like the intent of the framers and all the rest of it. So interpreting the law or the Constitution, which we call the law of the land, basically does not give people free rein. Rather, they are limited by the text, by what's in the document itself. That's where we've been. Also, Kramer says, another difference between law and politics is related to the people involved in it. Where politics is what he calls is the realm of legislatures and executives and politically accountable officials, law is the realm of lawyers and judges and courts. And all of this goes into this popular view of the Constitution and what Madison intended it to be. Kramer points out that popular constitutionalism is different. He says where popular constitution differs from present-day understandings is that it doesn't assume that authoritative legal interpretation only can take place in the courts, but instead supposes that a valid interpretation of the Constitution can be given and undertaken by the political branches and by the community at large. That, in other words, the entire country ought to be involved actively in the ongoing evolution and interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. Not just attorneys and judges. And he points out something to make this case that I wanted to share with you, because it makes some sense to me. Does it not seem strange, he asks, to celebrate a system of government for its commitment to self-government, meaning popular control of the government and laws, and then to turn around and say that the most important laws are too important to be left to an ignorant population? He cites Jeremy Waldron, who has written, rightly, Kramer thinks, how deeply at odds this mistrust of the capacity of the ordinary citizens to think responsible about rights is when we think about the assumptions we make about why the people are entitled to have those rights in the first place. That they are human beings, they can think, they are endowed with an ability to deliberate morally, to see things from others' points of view, and to transcend a preoccupation with their own particular or sectional interests, unquote. What Kramer believes that quote makes perfect sense. That in a sense, there's a contradiction between bragging about our government because it gives people right to participate in it, and then operating in ways which say the people aren't qualified to participate intelligently in it. The thinking has been, the popular interpretation of Madison and the Constitution has been, that the Constitution was an effort to step away from that and return decision-making power to the people most qualified to exercise it. It's that assumption or that interpretation that Larry Kramer challenges. He says popular constitutionalism is a broad idea. It's based on the idea that final authority to control the interpretation and implementation of constitutional law resides at all times in the community in an active sense. And that takes him to James Madison. Madison, he says, conceptualized a system of deliberative democracy meant to apply equally to ordinary politics and constitutional control, whose general contours, once properly understood, seem as potentially relevant today as they were in Madison's own time. The qualification here is once properly understood. And this leads Kramer into the popular view of what Madison and the writing of the Constitution was all about. According to this view, he says, Madison was frightened of popular politics and deeply suspicious of majority rule, which he came to believe threatened to ruin the nation. He saw politics playing out in the states during the period right after the Revolution. He was in the Virginia Assembly for 3 years in the 1780s. He saw the partisanship and the haggling and the struggles, if you will, over getting pieces of legislation passed in government. According to this popular view, Kramer says, Madison did not give in, though, to despair. Instead, he set out to solve the problem. And the new Constitution created what Gordon Wood has called a fresh science of politics in America. And here's the view of Madison that has prevailed, Larry Kramer tells us. The critical problem, as Madison saw it, was finding a way to choose representatives capable of governing without succumbing to the corrupting influences of faction, insularity, and lust for popularity and power. Thus, in Federalist number 10, Madison explained that size could do the trick. A large republic meant large election districts. The sheer number of voters and variety of interests in such large districts would make getting elected impossible for candidates who had parochial views or who were beholden to narrow interests. In other words, more voters, more interests. That meant that only the best people could get elected in this larger electoral district. As broad support became a necessity for office, elections would be, quote, more likely to center on men who possess the most attractive merit and the most diffusive and established characters. Only the wisest, best educated, most publicly spirited would be chosen to serve. Thus, that's what Madison supposedly means when he speaks about a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary and partial considerations. This background, believing that the people were not up to the challenge, causes us, not just us, but a lot of people, to misread Madison, Kramer says. When we see him using the phrase, a chosen body of citizens, it causes us to think that he means the elite. He doesn't, according to Kramer and according to me. He now means the people who are chosen as representatives from the community itself and maintain an accountability and responsibility to serve the interests of the constituents who elected him. In a sense, then, we have allowed our prejudices, if you will, to cause us or affect the way that we interpret James Madison. Kramer also says that in Madison's thinking, according to this interpretation, size would dilute faction so that only the wiser, justice-loving representatives could use their superior wisdom to get elected. So, according to the traditional interpretation of Madison and the intent behind the Constitution, the result of all of this, Kramer says, is a deliberative democracy in which elections are structured to sift out an elite that can then deliberate on our behalf, free from the irrationality, unreasonableness, and self-interest that make popular politics so dangerous. The fact of the matter is, nowhere here does Madison talk about the judiciary. Only in Federalist 39 does Madison address the issue of the judicial branch. He says that it would be an impartial umpire in disputes between the national government and the state governments. But other than that, he never talks about what we call judicial review. He never talks about the court having the exclusive right to interpret the Constitution at the expense of the citizens at large. Kramer believes, and I think so do I, that Madison's assumption is that citizens must still participate in the interpretation of the Constitution. And his Constitution, as it's drafted and ratified, is a way to do it. And that's Kramer's whole theme. And that's basically where I think we can best go in the next couple of programs. I think this is fascinating and interesting because basically it challenges a very popular interpretation of the Constitution of the United States as an elite document. Think back to Charles Beard's economic interpretation of the Constitution and his efforts to suggest that the founders were, in effect, representative of the aristocracy, not the entire population, and that the founders drafted a Constitution that more than anything else benefited them and made sure that the right kinds of people held power under this Constitution. In other words, that it was an elitist document. Beard tried to argue that it was an elitist document based on economics, on financial influence and power. Kramer says that reading James Madison this way misstates his thinking, misrepresents his theory, Madison called these constitutional items auxiliary precautions to the primary dependence on the people. Madison said, in bestowing the eulogies due to the petitions and internal checks of power, it ought not the less to be remembered that they are neither the sole nor the chief palladium, safeguard, of constitutional liberty. The people who are the authors of this blessing must also be its guardians. In other words, the idea of popular constitutionalism, which is a denial of the idea of judicial supremacy, the idea that the courts are the only place that the Constitution can be interpreted in the proper way. That constitutes a direct challenge to John Marshall's statement that the Supreme Court defines what the law is, which is one of his famous lines in, I believe, Marbury versus Madison, 1803. In a footnote, Larry Kramer tries to clarify himself about Madison. And this is him kind of sharing his thoughts. And I think they really help an awful lot. Let me quote him if I can. He says, to some extent, the prevailing misinterpretation of Madison comes from focusing so obsessively on what he wrote between the calling of the Philadelphia Convention and the successful conclusion of ratification. Indeed, he said, I even toyed with the idea of titling this lecture, James Madison was born before 1786, and he died after 1790. The implication that the only thing that mattered in Madison's life is what he did for the 4 years between 1786 and 1790 with the final ratification of the Constitution. Because, Kramer says, a very different Madison let me find my reference here. Here it is, I'm sorry. He says a very different Madison emerges if we read what he said when the Constitution was composed against the background of his entire political life. Madison's entire career was dedicated to making Republican government work. He read and thought and wrote about it all the time. Yet most constitutional and political theorists seem to know only the 29 essays he wrote as Publius in the Federalist Papers, and not even all of those. Essays that were produced at a particular moment to address particular problems. Even writers who pay attention to Madison's earlier and later writings seems caught up in this deference to the Federalist Papers. They generally assume that that's the only Madison that matters, which in effect causes us to conclude that Madison must have been a flip-flopper, because at times he was a nationalist, at other times he was a states writer. He seemed to believe different things at different times. Was he inconsistent? Was he a politician who flip-flopped? What was he? Kramer believes that this misunderstands Madison, who was quite consistent over the 50-some-odd years of his public life. Madison's thinking did change. His ideas evolved as he confronted new ideas and new circumstances, and learned that things didn't always work as you expected them to work. Madison was a nationalist in the 1780s. He was a states' rights supporter in the 1790s, and he became a nationalist again in the 1830s. But his principles hadn't changed. Circumstances were different. Problems were different. In the 1780s, he was trying to create a national central government that he felt was necessary to support independence. In the 90s, he became a states' rights advocate because he opposed Hamilton and the Federalists who controlled the national government. The only place to challenge the national government was through the states. After the War of 1812, he becomes a nationalist again. But his faith in creating a deliberative democracy never changed. And I think that's the thing that we all need to keep in mind and look for in this process. And then Kramer goes into Madison's background at the time of the Revolution. Madison was a student at Princeton. And I think we've talked about this. He didn't go to William and Mary, which many of the people around him did. He went to Princeton instead. And there he met people from all different parts of the country, different parts of the world. He became much more worldly, much more outgoing in his years in Princeton. These were in the early 70s. In 1772, he had to leave Princeton and go back to Virginia. And Kramer tells us that the next couple of years, 1772 to 1775, were the most boring in Madison's life. This is the period when all the history books tell us that Madison's illness, Madison's medical problems took over. Madison becomes very depressed. He's writing his former classmates at Princeton. And he's basically expressing his boredom. In a letter to his father, while he's still at Princeton, he said, "I was so particular in my last letter with regard to my determination about staying in Princeton this winter that I need say nothing more in this place, my sentiments being still the same." He was ill, he was depressed. But in April of 1782, he went back to Virginia. And according to Kramer, the 2 years that followed were the lowest in his life. He suffered from depression. He had a close friend in Princeton named William Bradford. And he continued to write to Bradford and others who were still in Philadelphia, who now lived in Philadelphia, rather. And this is what he said to Bradford in one letter. "You being at the fountainhead of political and literary intelligence, and I being in an obscure corner of the world, you must expect to be greatly the loser on that score in our correspondence." In other words, you are where everything is happening. I am where nothing is happening. Therefore, when we exchange letters, what value comes out of these letters is going to come from you, not from me, because I'm in a place where nothing is going on. And this is a letter to Bradford written a little bit later than that. Madison said, "A watchful eye must be kept on ourselves, lest we are building ideal monuments of renown and bliss here. We neglect to have our names enrolled in the annals of heaven. These thoughts come to my mind because I'm writing you and thinking about you. As to myself, I am too dull and infirm now to look for any extraordinary things in this world, for I think my sensations for many months past have intimated to me not to expect a long or healthy life. Yet it may be better with me after some time, though I hardly dare expect it, and have little spirit and alacrity to set about anything that is difficult in acquiring and useless in possessing after one has exchanged time for eternity." In other words, this is one of the most depressing letters that I've ever read. You have health, youth, fire, and genius to bear you along through the high tract of public life. and so may be more interested and delighted in improving on hints that respect the temporal, though momentous concerns of man. All of this changed in 1774 because Madison became involved in the politics that led to the revolution, to the independence movement. And he says in a letter to Bradford at this time, he hasn't yet. He said, I do not meddle with politics, but this calamity lies so near the heart of every friend of the country that I could not but mention it, and that's the struggle with England. And then he said, away with politics. Let me address you as a student and philosopher and not as a patriot. That all changed in Boston with the Boston Massacre and the driving British troops out of Boston in the summer of 1774. Madison caught the fever, became a convert to independence. He became a militant Whig, according to Kramer. He began advocating preparations for war. He became exciting his neighbors about the willingness to fight, hoping that it would inflame everybody in the province. By the time of Lexington and Concord, Madison had found purpose and adopted the ideals that would guide him for the rest of his life, which was setting up a Republican form of government in this country with independence. This is a background on Madison that I hadn't seen anywhere before. And I wanted to share it because I think it's real. I can personally speak to this myself. When I went to college, first of all, I didn't go to college right out of high school. I worked 3.5 years before I made the decision to go to college. And I didn't come from a family where college was a regular thing. I was the first one in my family to go to college. I had a good job in a factory, a paper mill in New England, in Boston. And when I approached my dad about quitting my job to go to college to become a teacher, my dad, in all honesty and seriousness, said to me, "What the hell are you thinking about doing? Why would you give up a job that pays a decent wage to go to school for 4 years to get a job that pays the same wage, or maybe even less?" But I did. I went to school full-time in Boston College. I was a commuter student. I took public transportation, the subway, every day into downtown Boston to go to school. I was teaching. I wanted to teach history, but I didn't feel that I knew enough, so I decided I want to go to graduate school, and I ended up going to the University of Wisconsin. And I was there during the anti-war protests, and my whole life changed in the years that I was on that Madison campus. And suddenly I became interested in international affairs. I became interested in the origins of the Vietnam War. I became interested in the nation's past. And to me, it was kind of coming alive. When I read Kramer, and I read Kramer's account of Madison being at Princeton and then having to leave Princeton, where he was involved in everything. He helped set up a debating society at Princeton. He was very involved as a student in student activities. And then having to go back to Virginia and leave it all. He went through a period of depression. He didn't know why he was there, where he wanted to be, what he wanted to do, until the protests against the mother country started. And he became caught up in those. He became an activist. And he basically established the goals and ideals and principles that drove the rest of his life. That makes a lot of sense to me, because I experienced some of the same things myself. I felt that those experiences in turn made me a much better teacher later in life. And I think all of us, all young people, tend to go through the same kinds of things. For many of them, their future path is dictated by parents, by overly controlling parents. Or they go to, when I'm in teaching, for example, in college, I can't tell you how many students have no idea what they want to be when they get through. They aren't going to school for a purpose, a specific purpose. They're going to school because they've grown up in a society where everybody tells them that you got to go to school and get a college degree in order to have a chance at a successful life in this world. So a lot of them are there looking for themselves, as it were. I did the same thing. I kind of know. I just knew that what I was doing before I went to college was not what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I came up with the idea of being a teacher, but it seemed within reach and it seemed something that I might be able to handle. So I did it. But I really didn't have a purpose. But then everything changed. I think it changed for James Madison as well. And that's what we'll be going into in future programs. We've got about half a minute left in our time together today. I really want to thank you for your continued support of the program and of the Head On Radio Network. Bob and Agnes, I said Alice, I'm sorry, Agnes, do a wonderful job keeping this on the air. They've done it for years. You've continued to support them through all of that time. In the 6.5 years I've been doing this program, you've supported me as well. And I thank you for it. Not one time do I ever overlook or not appreciate the level of support that you give that makes all of this possible. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of this Wednesday. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of this week. I know in our area the weather continues to be good, extremely dry, but good. So with that, I want to say thank you. Have a wonderful week. Be good to each other. And again, thank you.